A gang of outlaws surrounds his cabin, led by a ghost from his old life, hungry for revenge. Their leader knows who he really was and wants to settle the score. To protect his wife and son, he'll reveal his terrifying true nature, risking their love forever. That night turned a quiet home into a battlefield. Hey listener, how's it going and where are you tuning in from? Josiah swung the axe with steady precision, splitting a thick log clean in two. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, and the thwack of the blade echoed across the clearing. His broad shoulders, dusted with 50 years of hard living, moved like a machine, each swing deliberate, honed by a life he no longer spoke of. The cabin sat squat and sturdy at the edge of the Montana wilderness, its weathered logs blending into the towering pines. Inside, Sarah kneaded dough at the rough-hewn table, her hands dusted with flour, while their son, Samuel, 20 years old and lanky, cleaned a fresh-killed deer by the shed. The rhythm of their life was simple: chop, hunt, eat, sleep, and Josiah guarded it like a man shielding a candle from the wind. His graying beard hid the scars on his jaw, and his hazel eyes stayed fixed on the work, avoiding questions his family never asked. Every motion of his carried a faint trace of something sharper, something trained. The way he balanced the axe, the quick glance he threw toward the tree line, checking for movement. It wasn't just habit. It was survival, etched into his bones from a past he'd buried deep. Sarah caught him sometimes, staring into the fire at night, his face tight, like he was wrestling ghosts. She never pushed, though. She'd learned to love the quiet man who built this life for them, who carved toys for Samuel when he was small and carried her over mud puddles after spring rains. To her, Josiah was a rock, steady and unyielding, even if his silences ran deeper than the mountain streams. Samuel, wiping sweat from his brow, hung the deer carcass on a hook and called out, asking if supper was soon. His voice broke the morning stillness, and Josiah gave a short nod, setting the axe against a stump. He walked toward the cabin, boots crunching on frost-kissed grass, and paused to scan the horizon. Nothing stirred but a hawk circling high above, its shadow flickering over the valley. He let out a slow breath, the kind a man releases when he's waiting for something he hopes never comes. Inside, the smell of baking bread wrapped around him, warm and familiar. Sarah looked up, her brown eyes soft, and offered a small smile. "Table's set," she said, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of a woman who'd made peace with isolation. Josiah sat, his calloused hands folding together, and they bowed their heads for a brief prayer. The clink of tin plates and the scrape of a spoon filled the quiet. Samuel talked about fixing the fence tomorrow, his words full of a young man's restless energy. Josiah listened, nodding, his mind half on the conversation, half on the weight of the rifle leaning against the wall. He'd built this life to escape the blood and dust of his old days, believing the mountains could hide him forever. But deep down, in the pit of his gut, he knew the past was a hound that never stopped tracking. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's walls. Sarah slid a loaf of fresh-baked bread onto the table, its crust golden and steaming in the cool evening air. The scent mingled with the savory tang of venison stew simmering on the stove, filling the small room with warmth. Josiah sat at the head of the table, his thick fingers wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, the steam curling past his weathered face. Across from him, Samuel leaned back in his chair, carving a small piece of wood with a pocket knife, his hand steady but restless. The clink of spoons against bowls and the soft scrape of Sarah's chair as she sat down were the only sounds for a moment, a rhythm as familiar as the mountain winds outside. Sarah glanced at Josiah, her eyes tracing the lines etched deep around his mouth. She'd grown used to his quiet ways, the way he'd stare out the window sometimes, like he was looking for something beyond the trees. To her, it was just the weight of a hard life in the wilderness, nothing more. She reached for the butter, her sleeve brushing the table, and said, "We'll need more firewood before the snow hits. Maybe you and Samuel can haul some tomorrow." Her voice was calm, practical, the kind of tone that kept their little world steady. Josiah nodded, his gaze fixed on the stew, but his shoulders tensed slightly, as if her words had stirred something he didn't want to name. Samuel set his carving aside, the half-formed shape of a horse taking form under his blade. "I was thinking we could sell some pelts in town come spring," he said, his voice eager, full of plans. "Get enough to fix the roof proper, maybe buy a new rifle." He looked at his father, waiting for a response, but Josiah only gave a low hum, his eyes flicking to the window where the last light of dusk faded into black. The boy didn't notice the way his father's hand tightened around the mug, the knuckles whitening for a split second. To Samuel, Josiah was just Pa, strong, dependable, a man who could skin a deer or mend a fence without complaint. The meal went on, the three of them talking about small things: the fence that needed mending, the mare that was favoring her left hoof, the winter supplies they'd need to stock. Sarah smiled as Samuel spun ideas about trading in town, her pride in him, quiet but clear, in the way she leaned toward him. Josiah watched them both, his chest tight with a warmth he rarely let himself feel. This life, his wife's steady hands, his son's restless ambition, was all he'd fought to keep. He'd left behind the blood-soaked trails of his old days, trading them for this table, this fire, this fragile peace. As he spooned up the last of his stew, he let himself believe the past was gone, buried under years of calluses and silence. But the rifle by the door, its barrel gleaming faintly in the firelight, stood like a reminder he couldn't shake. The last embers of dusk bled into the horizon as the cabin's warmth held the family close. Josiah scraped the final bite of stew from his bowl, his eyes lingering on Sarah's hands as she cleared the table. The clatter of tin plates masked the faint howl of wind outside, a sound so familiar it barely registered. Samuel whittled at his wooden horse, the knife's soft rasp blending with the fire's crackle. Then a sharp bark from their old dog, Rusty, sliced through the evening calm, shrill and urgent. Josiah's head snapped up, his hand freezing mid-motion, the spoon hovering above the table. His gaze darted to the window, where darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing. He stood without a word, his chair scraping the floorboards, and crossed to the door in 3 strides. The air felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name but knew too well. Sarah paused, a dish towel in her hands, her brow furrowing as she watched him. "Just the dog," she said, her voice steady but questioning, like she was trying to convince herself. Josiah didn't answer. He cracked the door open, letting in a gust of cold that carried the scent of pine and something sharper, sweat and leather. Rusty's barks grew frantic, chained to his post by the shed, his shadow lunging against the moonlight. Stepping onto the porch, Josiah's boots thudded against the warped wood. His eyes scanned the clearing, catching faint shapes moving at the edge of the tree line. 5, maybe 6 figures, their outlines blurred but deliberate. The hair on his neck stood up, his pulse steady but hard, like a drum in his chest. Then a voice cut through the night, low and gravelly, dripping with menace. "Reaper," it called, spitting the name like a curse. "Time's up. You owe blood, and I'm here to collect." The word hit Josiah like a blade. That old name he'd buried years ago, now dragged into the open. His hand tightened on the doorframe, splinters biting his palm. Sarah appeared behind him, her breath catching as she peered into the dark. "Who's out there?" she whispered, her voice sharp with fear she didn't yet understand. Samuel joined her, his carving knife still in hand, his young face hardening as he sensed the shift in his father. Josiah's jaw clenched, his body blocking the doorway, shielding them from the shadows creeping closer. The voice spoke again, closer now, boots crunching on gravel. "You thought you could hide forever, didn't you? Run from what you did?" Each word was a hammer, pounding at the life Josiah had built. He didn't turn to face his family, couldn't bear to see their confusion. The figures stopped just beyond the clearing, their silhouettes jagged against the moonlight. Josiah's hand twitched toward the rifle inside, but he held still, every muscle coiled. Rusty's barks turned to growls, then a sharp yelp as something struck him silent. Sarah gasped, her hand gripping Josiah's arm, but he didn't move. The past had found him, clawing its way to his doorstep, and the peace he'd fought for was unraveling with every step those shadows took. The air inside the cabin turned thick, the warmth of the fire no match for the chill seeping through the cracks. Josiah slammed the door shut, the thud echoing like a gunshot. His hands moved fast, snatching the rifle from its peg by the wall, his fingers checking the chamber with a practiced snap. The man who'd been chopping wood and eating stew vanished, replaced by something cold and precise, his eyes narrowing to slits as he scanned the windows. Sarah stood frozen, her dish towel slipping to the floor, her breath shallow. Samuel gripped his carving knife, his knuckles white, staring at his father like he was seeing a stranger. Josiah's voice came low and sharp, cutting through the silence. "Sarah, bar the back door. Samuel, get the extra shells from the shelf." His words weren't a request. They were orders, delivered with a calm that made the air feel heavier. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling as she moved to the back door, shoving the wooden bar into place with a grunt. Samuel stumbled to the shelf, knocking over a tin cup that clattered to the floor. The sounds of their panic clashed with Josiah's steady movements, his boots pacing the room as he checked each window, his rifle cradled like an old friend. Outside, the shadows shifted, boots crunching closer, their low murmurs carrying through the thin walls. Josiah's jaw tightened, his mind racing through the terrain beyond the cabin, the ravine to the west, the thick pines to the east, the open clearing where no one could hide. He knew every inch of this land, had walked it 100 times, mapping it like a soldier. His hands didn't shake, but his chest ached with the weight of what was coming. He glanced at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes searching his for answers he couldn't give. "Josiah, what's happening?" Sarah's voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but it held an edge of demand. She stood by the table, her hands clenched, flour still dusting her fingers. He didn't meet her gaze, just kept moving, shoving a chair against the door for extra weight. "No time," he said, his tone flat, final. Samuel fumbled with the shells, dropping one that rolled across the floor. "Pa, who are they?" he asked, his voice shaking but trying to sound brave. Josiah's eyes flicked to his son just for a second, and something flickered there. Regret, maybe, or fear, but it was gone as fast as it came. "Stay low, both of you," he said, turning back to the window. The first shout came from outside, a taunt laced with venom. "Reaper! You can't run from this." The voice was closer now, maybe 20 yards out, and it carried the weight of old grudges. Josiah's hand tightened on the rifle, his body coiled like a spring. Sarah's breath hitched, her eyes darting between her husband and the door, realizing the man she loved was someone she didn't know. Samuel crouched by the table, his knife useless but clutched tight, watching his father move with a predator's grace. The cabin, once their sanctuary, felt like a trap, and Josiah's transformation was the first crack in the world they thought they knew. The cabin's walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of gun oil and fear. Josiah crouched by the front window, his rifle steady, eyes locked on the shifting shadows outside. The fire's glow cast harsh lines across his face, making him look older, harder, like a man carved from stone. Sarah stood by the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair, her breath short and sharp. Samuel knelt beside her, clutching a box of shells, his eyes darting between his father and the door. The taunts from outside grew louder, each word a jagged blade tearing at the life they'd built. "Reaper! You slaughtered my kin," the voice bellowed, raw with hate. "You think you can play family man now?" Sarah's head snapped toward Josiah, her face pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and betrayal. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Josiah, what's he talking about? Who's out there?" Her words hung heavy, demanding truth he'd hidden for years. Josiah kept his gaze on the window, his jaw tight, but his silence was louder than any answer. The voice outside laughed, cold and cruel. "Didn't tell her, did you? About the blood on your hands, about the men you hunted for the law." Each accusation landed like a blow, and Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Josiah's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his knuckles white, his focus unbroken. "Stay back, Sarah," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "This ain't the time." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She crossed the room, her boots thudding on the floorboards, and grabbed his arm, forcing him to face her. "You tell me now, Josiah. What did you do? Who are you?" Her voice cracked, her eyes searching his for the man she thought she knew. The firelight caught the tears welling in her eyes, but she held his gaze, refusing to let go. Samuel stood, his hand shaking as he set the shells on the table. "Pa, what's he mean?" "Hunted men. His voice was quieter than his mother's, but it carried the same raw need for answers. Josiah's eyes flicked to his son, just for a moment, and something broke in his expression. Pain, maybe, or shame. "I did what I had to," he said, his words clipped, final. "Long time ago. It's done." But the shouts outside said it wasn't done, not by a long shot. "You burned my brother alive, Reaper," the voice roared. Closer now, boots crunching just beyond the porch. Sarah let go of Josiah's arm, stepping back like she'd been burned. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. "All these years," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You lied to me." To us, Josiah's head dropped slightly, but he turned back to the window, his rifle ready. The truth was out. A poison spreading through the cabin, tearing apart the family he'd sworn to protect. The shouts outside grew louder, promising death. But the real damage was happening inside, where trust bled out faster than any bullet could spill. The cabin's walls creaked under the weight of the night, the fire's faint glow no match for the darkness pressing in. Josiah slipped out the back door, his boots silent on the frost-covered grass. The cold bit at his knuckles as he gripped his knife, its blade dulled by years of use but still deadly in his hands. The forest around the cabin was his domain, every tree and ravine mapped in his mind from countless hunts. He moved like a shadow, low and quick, his breath steady despite the shouts echoing from the clearing, the taunts of the outlaws. "Come out, Reaper," faded as he melted into the pines, his body remembering the old ways with a sickening ease. He crouched behind a fallen log, his eyes picking out the first target. A lanky figure pacing near the shed, rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. The man's lantern cast a weak pool of light, glinting off a bottle he tipped to his lips. Josiah's fingers tightened around the knife, his heart steady but heavy, knowing each move pulled him deeper into the man he'd sworn to leave behind. He waited, counting the man's steps, then sprang forward, silent as death. One hand clamped over the outlaw's mouth, the other drove the blade into his side, quick and clean. The body slumped, and Josiah dragged it into the brush, his hands slick with blood that smelled of iron and regret. The second man stood further out near the creek, his back to the trees as he lit a cigarette. The match's flare gave Josiah his mark. He moved through the undergrowth, avoiding twigs that might snap, his boots sinking into the soft earth. A loop of rope, coiled from his belt, became a garrote in his hands. He struck fast, the rope tightening around the man's throat before a sound could escape. The outlaw's heels kicked the dirt, then went still. Josiah lowered him to the ground, his chest tight, not from effort, but from the weight of what he was becoming again. From the cabin, the glow of the windows showed Sarah and Samuel inside, their shapes blurred but tense. Josiah's eyes lingered on them for a moment, his jaw clenching as he thought of the fear in Sarah's face, the questions in Samuel's. He pushed it down, forcing his focus back to the task. A third man circled closer to the porch, his boots loud on the gravel. Josiah rigged a tripwire from fishing line, tying it to a low branch, then lured the man with a tossed stone. The outlaw stumbled, cursing, and Josiah was on him, his knife flashing once before the body hit the ground. Each kill was precise, mechanical, but it carved something out of him. The forest, once his refuge, was now a killing ground, and he was its predator. The remaining outlaws hadn't noticed their numbers thinning, their shouts still bold, but Josiah knew time was short. He wiped the blood from his hands on his coat, his eyes scanning the darkness for the next target. The man he'd been for his family was slipping away, replaced by the Reaper they'd never known, and the thought of their faces watching him now burned worse than any wound. The night pressed heavy around the cabin, the air sharp with the tang of blood and pine. Josiah crouched in the shadows near the porch, his knife tucked back into its sheath, his hands steady despite the slick warmth coating them. Inside, the faint glow of the fire outlined Samuel's silhouette at the window, his face pressed close to the glass, eyes wide as he tracked his father's movements. The boy's breath fogged the pain, his hands fumbling with a rifle he'd barely used before. Josiah caught his son's gaze and raised a hand, a quick signal to stay put, but the look in Samuel's eyes, part awe, part terror, cut deeper than any blade. The outlaws' shouts had quieted, their numbers dwindling, but the danger was far from gone. Josiah slipped back toward the cabin, his boots silent on the gravel, and tapped the window twice. Samuel cracked it open, his hand shaking as he passed a box of shells through the gap. "Keep 'em coming," Josiah said, his voice low, steady, like he was asking for a tool, not bullets. Samuel nodded, his jaw tight, but his eyes kept darting to the bloodstains on his father's coat, dark and spreading. The boy's fingers fumbled, dropping a shell that clinked against the windowsill. "I got it, Pa," he said, forcing the words out, trying to match his father's calm. Josiah took the shells and moved to the side of the cabin, reloading his rifle with quick, precise movements. He gestured for Samuel to join him at the corner, pointing to a spot where the moonlight caught the glint of an outlaw's belt buckle, maybe 30 yards out. "Watch him," Josiah said, his voice a quiet command. "If he moves closer, you shoot." Samuel's hands tightened on his rifle, his breath hitching, but he nodded, his face pale under the brim of his hat. Josiah saw the fear in his son's eyes, the same fear he'd felt years ago, the first time he'd held a gun with intent to kill. The boy stayed low, his rifle propped against the wall, his eyes locked on the target. Josiah moved back into the shadows, circling toward another figure lurking near the shed. He didn't need to look back to know Samuel was watching, learning, being pulled into a world Josiah had sworn to keep him from. A crack of gunfire split the night, an outlaw firing blindly toward the cabin. Samuel flinched, his shoulder jerking, but he held his ground, his finger hovering near the trigger. Josiah's chest tightened, pride and guilt twisting together as he saw his son become something new, something harder. Another outlaw fell to Josiah's knife, a quick slash across the throat, the body crumpling into the dirt. He dragged it behind the shed, his hands moving fast, but his mind was on Samuel, on the boy's wide eyes and trembling hands. This was no deer hunt, no lesson in tracking. It was survival, raw and brutal, and Josiah hated that his son was learning it now like this. The cabin stood silent behind them, Sarah's shadow moving inside, her hands likely clutching a knife or a poker ready to fight. The night had turned them all into something else, and Josiah knew the lesson he was teaching Samuel would scar him deeper than any bullet. The night clung to the forest, heavy with the scent of blood and damp earth. Josiah dragged the bound outlaw through the pines, the man's boots scraping shallow trenches in the dirt. The captive's wrists were tied tight with rope, his face bruised from a quick, brutal blow Josiah had landed to silence him. The man's ragged breaths hissed through a busted lip, but his eyes burned with defiance, even as Josiah shoved him against a tree, the bark biting into the outlaw's back. The cabin's faint glow was barely visible through the trees, a reminder of what Josiah was fighting for, and what he was losing with every step into the dark. He knelt in front of the captive, his knife glinting in the moonlight as he pressed it just under the man's chin. "Talk," Josiah said, his voice low, steady, like he was asking about the weather. The outlaw spat blood onto the ground, his teeth bared in a sneer. "You're dead, Reaper. Caney'll gut you and your kin." The name hit Josiah like a punch. Caney, the ghost who'd called him out, the one who knew too much. Josiah's grip tightened on the knife, the blade nicking skin, drawing a thin line of red. "What does Caney want?" he asked, his words sharp, each one a warning. The outlaw's laugh was choked, bitter. "He wants you broken. Wants your woman and boy dead at your feet so you know what you took from him." The words landed heavy, each one twisting the knot in Josiah's gut. He leaned closer, his face inches from the captive's, his eyes cold as the steel in his hand. "Where's he at right now?" The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the clearing, and Josiah pressed the blade harder, just enough to make him flinch. "By the creek," the outlaw muttered, his voice cracking. "He's waiting for you to slip up." Josiah stood, his mind racing through the terrain, the creek's shallow bend, the open ground where Caney could pin him down. Killing the others wasn't enough. Caney wouldn't stop until the debt was paid in full. Josiah's hand twitched, the urge to end the captive right there strong, but he stopped himself. He gagged the man with a strip of cloth torn from his own sleeve, tying it tight, then dragged him deeper into the brush, securing him to a tree out of sight. The outlaw's muffled curses faded as Josiah moved back toward the cabin, his boots silent on the forest floor. The weight of the truth settled on him. Surviving the night wouldn't end this. Caney's hatred was a fire that wouldn't burn out until everything Josiah loved was ash. He glanced at the cabin, where Sarah's shadow moved behind the window, her hands likely still trembling from the truth she'd heard. Samuel's face flashed in his mind, the boy's eyes torn between fear and awe. Josiah's chest ached, not from the fight, but from the realization that protecting his family meant becoming the monster Caney remembered. He gripped his rifle tighter, the cold metal grounding him as he prepared for the next move, knowing the cost was climbing higher than he could bear. Dawn's first light bled across the horizon, painting the clearing in shades of gray and gold. The cabin stood battered, its windows cracked, bullet holes pocking the logs like scars. Josiah knelt behind a stack of firewood, his rifle steady, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. The remaining outlaws, maybe 4 or 5, had grown desperate, their shouts replaced by hurried whispers as they realized their numbers were thinning. Caney's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and commanding, rallying his men for a final push. Josiah's fingers tightened on the rifle, his eyes scanning the tree line, where shadows moved like wolves circling prey. Inside, Sarah shoved a table against the door, her hands shaking, but her movements fierce, driven by a mother's need to protect. Samuel crouched by the window, his rifle reloaded, his young face set in a grim mask that mirrored his father's. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat, the fire long dead, leaving the cabin cold and tense. A shot rang out, splintering the doorframe, and Sarah ducked, her arm shielding her face as wood chips flew. Josiah fired back, his bullet catching an outlaw in the shoulder, sending him sprawling into the dirt with a scream. The others charged, boots pounding, their gunfire wild but relentless, turning the cabin into a fortress under siege. Josiah moved fast, sliding to a new position behind the shed, his shots precise, each one dropping a man or forcing them to cover. Samuel followed his lead, firing from the window, his hand steadier now, though his eyes still flickered with fear. "Stay down, Ma," he shouted, his voice hoarse but firm, as another bullet shattered glass above Sarah's head. She grabbed a poker from the hearth, her knuckles white, ready to swing if anyone breached the door. Josiah caught a glimpse of her through the window, her face fierce despite the terror, and his chest tightened. He was fighting for her, but every shot widened the gulf between them. Caney's men pressed closer, their gunfire tearing through the cabin's walls, forcing Josiah to duck as splinters rained down. He reloaded, his hands slick with sweat, and took out another man with a shot to the chest, the body crumpling near the porch. The assault was chaotic, desperate, Caney's voice barking orders from the creek's edge, pushing his men forward like a general. Josiah knew this was it, the moment Caney would throw everything at them. He signaled Samuel to cover the east side, his son nodding without hesitation. Their movements synced in a way that both proud and gutted Josiah. The cabin shook as a heavy shoulder slammed against the door, the bar groaning under the pressure. Sarah braced herself, her poker raised, her eyes locked on the entrance. Josiah fired again, his bullet grazing an outlaw's arm, but the man kept coming, driven by Caney's orders, or fear of failure. The clearing was a haze of smoke and dust, the air thick with the sharp crack of rifles and the cries of the wounded. Josiah's hands were steady, but his heart pounded with the weight of what this fight was costing, not just blood but the family he'd built, now watching him become the killer he'd sworn to leave behind. The cabin's air was thick with smoke, the sharp sting of gunpowder burning Josiah's lungs. The door splintered under a final brutal kick, and Caney burst through, his silhouette filling the frame like a storm rolling in. His coat was tattered, blood streaking his arm, but his eyes burned with a hatred that hadn't dimmed since the night began. Josiah dropped his rifle, empty of shells, and lunged forward, tackling Caney to the floorboards before he could raise his pistol. The impact shook the room, a tin cup clattering off the table as Sarah stumbled back, her poker still gripped tight. Samuel froze by the window, his rifle useless, his face pale as he watched his father collide with the enemy. The two men rolled across the floor, fists and elbows flying in a brutal tangle. Caney's fist caught Josiah's jaw, snapping his head back, but Josiah drove his knee into Caney's gut, forcing a grunt of pain. Blood smeared the floor, slick under their boots as they grappled, each move fueled by years of unresolved grudges. Caney's voice hissed through clenched teeth, his breath hot against Josiah's face. "You took everything from me, Reaper." "My brother, my life," Josiah didn't answer. His arm locking around Caney's throat, squeezing hard, his muscles straining as he fought to end it. Sarah's gasp cut through the chaos, her hands trembling as she clutched the poker, her eyes locked on the men. Josiah caught her look. Fear, yes, but also horror at the man he'd become. He slammed Caney's head against the floor, the crack of skull on wood loud in the sudden quiet. Caney's pistol skidded across the room, and Josiah pinned him down, his knife flashing from his belt. "This ends now," Josiah growled, his voice raw, each word heavy with finality. Caney's eyes narrowed, a sneer twisting his bloodied lips. "You'll never outrun it. You're a killer, same as me." The words hit harder than any punch, but Josiah's grip didn't waver. He pressed the blade to Caney's throat, his hand steady, but his chest ached with the truth in those words. Samuel stepped forward, his voice breaking the tension. "Pa, don't!" The boy's plea was desperate, his hands outstretched, as if he could pull his father back from the edge. Sarah's breath hitched, her poker lowering slightly, her eyes darting between her husband and the man beneath him. Josiah's gaze flicked to them, just for a moment, and he saw the fear, not of Caney, but of him. With a final surge, Josiah drove the knife home, Caney's body jerking once before going still. The room fell silent, save for the ragged sound of Josiah's breathing. He stood, his hands slick with blood, the knife clattering to the floor. Sarah backed against the wall, her poker dropping with a dull thud. Samuel's eyes were wide, his rifle forgotten, staring at his father like he was a stranger. The fight was over, but the cost was carved into their faces. The cabin's shattered remains a mirror of the family now broken. Josiah stood over Caney's body, his shoulders heavy, knowing the man he'd killed wasn't the only thing he'd lost that night. The first rays of sunlight sliced through the shattered windows, painting the cabin's floor in streaks of red and gold. Josiah stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his hands slick with blood that wasn't all Cain's. The air stank of gunpowder and death, the floor littered with splinters and spent shells. Caney's body lay crumpled by the door, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Outside, the clearing was a graveyard, bodies strewn across the dirt, their weapons glinting uselessly in the dawn. Josiah's knife, still wet, rested on the table where Sarah had served supper just hours before. Sarah leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tight, her face pale as she stared at the floor, avoiding Josiah's gaze. Samuel stood by the window, his rifle hanging limp in his hands, his eyes fixed on the carnage outside. The silence was heavier than the gunfire had been, broken only by the creak of the bullet-riddled door swinging on its hinges. Josiah wiped his hands on his torn coat, the motion slow, deliberate, but it couldn't erase the blood or the weight of what he'd done. His shoulders sagged, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that he'd saved his family only to lose them in a different way. He took a step toward Sarah, his boots crunching on broken glass. "It's over," he said, his voice rough, almost pleading. She didn't look up, her fingers digging into her arms, leaving red marks on her skin. Samuel turned, his face hard, his eyes meeting Josiah's for a moment before flicking away. "You killed them all, Pa," he said, his voice low, not accusing, but hollow, like he was trying to make sense of the man before him. Josiah's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides, but he had no words to bridge the gap between them. The cabin, once their sanctuary, was a ruin, bullet holes in the walls, the table overturned, blood staining the floorboards. Josiah moved to the door, pushing it shut with a grunt, the wood scraping against the frame. He looked out at the clearing, at the bodies he'd left behind, each one a piece of the past he'd tried to bury. His hands shook now, not from fear, but from the truth Caney had spat at him. He was a killer, and no amount of love could wash that away. Sarah's silence and Samuel's distant stare told him they saw it too. He turned back, his eyes lingering on his family, standing together but apart. Sarah's shoulders trembled, her breath uneven, as if she was holding back a scream. Samuel set his rifle against the wall, his movements slow, like he was afraid to make a sound. Josiah wanted to reach for them, to pull them close, but his hands, stained, calloused, deadly, felt wrong, unfit for comfort. The threat was gone, the sun was rising, but the cost of survival lay heavy in the room, a wound deeper than any bullet could cut. Josiah stood alone, his family safe but forever changed, their eyes seeing not their protector, but the monster who'd saved them. The cabin stood quiet under the midday sun, its bullet-scarred walls baking in the heat. 3 days had passed since the fight, and the air inside carried the faint smell of soap and wood smoke as Sarah scrubbed bloodstains from the floorboards. Her hands moved slow, deliberate, the rag turning red, then clean, then red again. Josiah sat at the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, his eyes fixed on a knot that looked like a scar. Samuel was outside, hammering boards over the shattered windows, each strike loud and steady, filling the silence that had settled over them like dust. The bodies were gone, buried in a shallow trench beyond the clearing, but their presence lingered in the cracks of the family's life. Sarah didn't look at Josiah, her shoulders stiff as she worked, her breath sharp and controlled. She'd barely spoken since that night, her words clipped when she did, about chores, food, the fence that needed fixing. Josiah watched her hands, the same hands that had kneaded bread and patched his shirts, now moving like they belonged to someone else. He wanted to say something, to explain, but his throat tightened every time he tried. His coat, still stained with blood despite her washing, hung by the door, a reminder he couldn't escape. He'd protected them, but the cost was etched in the way Sarah's eyes slid past him. Samuel came in, wiping sweat from his brow, his hammer dangling from his hand. He set it on the table, the metal clanking against the wood, and grabbed a cup of water. "Windows are done," he said, his voice flat, not meeting his father's gaze. Josiah nodded, his fingers stilling on the table, his chest heavy with the distance in his son's tone. The boy who'd once followed him through the woods, eager for stories, now moved like a man carrying a weight he didn't ask for. Josiah saw it in the way Samuel's shoulders hunched, in the way he lingered near his mother, like she was the only anchor left. The fire crackled low, its warmth doing little to ease the chill between them. Josiah stood, his chair scraping the floor, and walked to the door, his boots heavy on the creaking boards. He paused, his hand on the frame, looking out at the clearing where he'd fought, where he'd become the Reaper again. "I did what I had to," he said, his voice rough, directed at no one and everyone. Sarah's rag stopped moving, her hands frozen, but she didn't look up. Samuel's cup paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes flicking to his father, then away, hard and unreadable. Josiah stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, but cold in his bones. The forest stretched beyond, silent and vast, but it offered no refuge now. He'd saved his family, kept their home standing, but the peace he'd built was gone, shattered like the windows Samuel had boarded up. Sarah and Samuel stayed inside, together in their silence, their fear of him a wall he couldn't climb. Josiah stood alone, the man who'd won the fight, but lost the only thing that mattered, his hands empty of everything but the blood they'd spilled.